Welcome to Fork in the Road, a conversation about the decisions that shape our lives. My name is Rusty Gaylord. I am your host, and I'm happy to be here with Todd Cherches today. We're going to be digging in a little bit to Todd's career and his life trajectory, and what are some of the changes in his life that helped to bring him to where he is. Because it's the decisions we make day to day that shape our lives and really inform who we become. A little bit about Todd before we get going here. He is the CEO and co-founder of Big Blue Gumball, an innovative New York City-based leadership development and executive coaching firm. He's got a bunch of accolades. I'm going to tick through them here. He's the member of Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100 Coaches, founding partner of Global Institute for Thought Leadership, just nominated by Thinkers 50 on the shortlisted finalist for their 2021 Distinguished Achievement Award for Leadership. He's on the 2021 Thinkers 360 list of top 50 global thought leaders, three-time award-winning adjunct professor at NYU and a lecturer at Columbia University. He's a TEDx speaker on the power of visual thinking and author of a groundbreaking new book, Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and in Life, which was published last year by Postal Press and Simon & Schuster. So please welcome Todd Cherches. Hey, Todd.
Hey, Rusty. Good to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks for being here. As we were chatting here just before we started, you described that your life was kind of bouncing along on this flat trajectory, kind of, ups and downs, but pretty stable. And then in the last couple of years, it took a total change and it was really taken off. But I'd love to rewind a little bit and start us in this conversation. Where was your life back then when it was kind of bouncing along in this flat trajectory? What was going on for you? Because I just read through your list of accolades. You're doing so well now. I'd love to hear a little bit about what it was like before, and then we can talk about some of the decisions and some of those forks in the road that led you from there to here.
Sure. I have a little bit of a imposter syndrome going on as I listen to that. I'm like, wait a minute, who's he talking about? Because I never would have envisioned any of that 15, 20 years ago. I talk about in my TED Talk how as a little kid, people will say, Todd, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I'd say, I want to be Superman. And I'll say, well, that's a great aspiration, but if you can't be Superman, then what? What would you want to be? And I said, Batman. So like those are my two career aspirations as a kid. So, but growing up as a kind of baby boomer, Gen X on the borderline, obsessed with television. I did want to work in the TV industry, and I started out my career at Ogilvy and Mather Advertising in the media division. I wanted a more creative type of job, but I ended up in media, which is a very numbers-driven job. So as much as I didn't want to do that job, I learned a lot. I learned what I didn't like to do and what I was not good at. And after a year, my dream was to work in television. So I actually moved out to LA with no contacts, I had two college roommates who lived out there, no money, nothing. And I just thought I'm going to try that. I didn't even know what I wanted to do. I just knew I wanted to work in Hollywood in television in some capacity.
So can I jump in with a question there? Sure. So I think it's great. So first of all, one of the things I always tell people is right out of college, of course, you don't know what you want to do, right? You've never worked before. So You went and you did something, you found you didn't like it, and you decided to make a change. That's great. But how did you get the guts to just uproot and move across the country?
Yeah, that was really hard. That was actually the hardest thing I ever did because I'm an extreme introvert. Even though I talk loud and fast because I'm a New Yorker, I always say I'm a 3Bs guy, a back of the room, behind the scenes bookworm by nature. So that's me. So to do anything beyond that is pushing myself way out of my comfort zone. But I think I was so miserable in my job and in my life at that time. New York was really not a good place to be at that time in like mid 80s. I was commuting. I couldn't afford my own apartment, so I was commuting from Long Island 2 hours each way, living at my parents, I always ask my students to guess my starting salary. What would you guess my starting salary was in 1986 as a media buyer at Ogilvy and Mather Advertising?
I'm going to guess $20,000 a year.
I wish it was 12,000.
Wow.
And how do you live on that, right? So I was just really unhappy. And I think I went out to LA during my 1 week of vacation I got after a year of working there. And I visited my college roommate in LA and I just saw that Hollywood sign. I'm like, this is where I need to be. And I got back home. My parents picked me up at the airport and I said, I'm moving out there. And they were like, oh, yeah, right. Yeah. And I did. I quit my job and I just packed up. So it was a mix of desperation and hope. I had no hope in New York. So I figured I'd give it a shot. And it was really the biggest risk I ever took at that point in my life.
It's so interesting. It's this it is a combination of desperation and hope. And I
Yeah.
think that's true for any decision we make. And I'm
Yeah.
sure we'll talk about more as we go forward. But this, like, and it doesn't have to get all the way to desperation, but it can at least be, I'm not satisfied where I am. I don't like it. But the hope or the desire, the vision of there's something out there that I want, and a willingness to go for it.
Yeah.
I just have a lot of respect for people like you who've made those kind of choices in life. I think it's awesome.
It was hard. But again, I was so depressed. I was so miserable. I felt like, yeah. And my mother said, she said, you could be out there for a week or 2 weeks. If you hate it, come back. Right. There was no pressure. There was no risk. So my parents made it very safe. But my father was an accountant and an IRS agent for 35 years. And he would take me to work with him sometimes. And he'd show me around and introduce me to people. And they'd say, Harvey, what are you showing around? So he'll follow in your footsteps. And he said, no, so he won't. So my father knew I was destined for something bigger, better, more creative. He took the safe route, a very stable job with a pension and everything else. But I knew that wasn't for me, and he knew that as well. So with my parents' encouragement, they always encouraged me to try new things. And I was, in addition to my television obsession, I was also an obsessive reader. One of my claims to fame in high school, and I had none because I was unknown, an extreme bookworm and nerd, but I read the complete works of Shakespeare by the time I was 18. I got so hooked on Shakespeare from Mr. Patterson, my ninth grade English teacher. I just read one after another. I finished the entire Riverside Shakespeare by the time I was 18. So I was a little, more than a little obsessive. So when I got hooked on something, I got obsessed with it. So between television and literature, it was about, a lot of the work I do now is around storytelling, right? And if you think about it, my roots go all the way back to that from a very early age.
Yeah. Hold on, there we go. I wanted to show you the, working to give everyone the full background there so they can see everything that is all of the books behind you. They got a glimpse for a second, but
I thought you disappeared. I didn't know what happened. So
no, it's the full Bookworm effect.
Okay. Yeah, one of the things, I'm fast forwarding, foreshadowing, but when I moved back from LA, and I'll go back to LA for a second, I got a job with the American Management Association. They hired me to revamp their mini MBA program, even though I have an English literature background and not an MBA. And I started reading these management leadership books, and the light bulb went off, because one of the recurring themes in my life, I don't know if you've ever seen the Guinness Book of World Records, but I hold the record for having worked for the most horrible bosses in the history of the world. Like, I challenge anyone to that competition. Toxic, sadistic, and abusive bosses. And I actually kept an abuse log for a number of years, just to track all of these, the horrible bosses I had when I worked in Hollywood. But that's how I got hooked on business books. I started reading management leadership books and Peter Drucker and all the, Warren Bennis, and I realized that, hey, there's a better way to manage and lead than just to be bossy and telling people what to do. And I've been reading an average of one business book a week since 1998. So that's 22 years, if my math is correct. I'm not a math person, but so I've long passed 1,000. I think I'm up to like 1,100 to 1,200 business books that I've read since the last 22 years.
Wow. So were those books instrumental in you transitioning or pivoting to the career you're in now?
Yeah, they laid the foundation. I mean, my book, luckily I read very fast. I have a good memory, so I could quote books and chapters and lines from books. And people kept saying, you're always talking about all these other books. When are you going to write your own book? Which led me to eventually writing my own book. But going back to LA, I moved out there. I didn't know what I wanted to do. But so I got a number of temp jobs and part-time jobs. But at night, I worked as a bouncer in a nightclub. So it's a whole other side of my life that only comes up occasionally. So I actually wrote a pilot script for Disney called Bouncer by Night, about a guy who taught psychology during the day, but worked at nights in a bounce club and at a nightclub. And who knew that someday I'd actually be a teacher or professor.
Yeah, well, there might be a little overlap there between psychology and being a bouncer at a nightclub.
Yeah, there definitely was. There definitely was. So I worked for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees in production. I worked for Aaron Spelling on Dynasty. I worked in casting at Columbia Pictures. I was in comedy at Disney and drama at CBS. So those were my jobs in the TV industry. All it's administrative assistant type jobs. I just could not crack that barrier to a manager level job, even though I applied all the time. And I always thought my work would speak for myself. But you need to speak for yourself. I think that's one of the key ahas I say to people. My work didn't speak because I didn't have the confidence to self-promote or to raise my hand. So I did great work, but I was never recognized, and I was never assertive. And one of my models was called CAP, confidence, assertiveness, and presence, and I had none of that at that time in my life.
So what did you do? Like, when do you recognize that? Because at this point you're reading all these books, right? So you're learning some of this, but how did you make the personal transition? Because there's a difference between knowing something and doing it. And a
Yeah.
lot of people will read a book and know something, but putting it into practice and applying it feels risky. It feels uncomfortable. You feel like you're going to do it wrong. So how did you make that journey?
Yeah, that's the hard part. So after my years in TV, I actually got a job because I was so miserable at my job at one of the TV networks, where I had a really horrible boss. I took a job as a project coordinator for a theme park production company where my friend worked. And I talked about this in my TED Talk, and they promoted me to project manager. And all of a sudden they were like, you're going to have to go to China for 3 weeks to oversee this installation. Now, I didn't even have a passport at this time. And I tried to come up with every excuse for not going because I was terrified of flying and just that talk about pushing me out of my comfort zone. But I ended up going. I went. It was a life-changing experience, and I proved to myself I could do more than I thought I could do. And then after my 10 years in LA, I had gotten laid off from a job, broken up with someone, and my father had just had open heart surgery. And my mother said, I think the universe is telling you to come back to New York. So I moved back to New York. Didn't know what I wanted to do. And then that's where I just fell into that job at the American Management Association. And that set me off on this path in the management leadership world. And that's what I do today. So that's like the abbreviated version of my career path that led me up to, going into leadership development, becoming an executive coach.
Yeah. So, I mean, what I hear in that is a couple of themes, but one is a willingness to do the thing that you're uncomfortable with, right? Starting with moving to LA, picking up and moving. But then, the second example of that, I'm sure there's many of them, but another one you gave of going to this theme park as a project manager in China. And I remember reading about this in your book. It was a great, great story. But just that whole willingness of, even resisting it, dragging your feet, but in the end, being willing to go.
Yeah. Always having self-doubt. It's like anytime I push becoming a college professor, doing my TED Talk, writing a book, you say, who wants to read what I have to say, right? So like there's always that self-doubt of who am I to be doing this, right? And that's like, but if not, but if everyone said that, then no one would ever do anything, right? So part of it is pushing yourself, taking risks, dealing with rejection. I've had to deal with a lot of rejections, a lot of setbacks, things I applied for and didn't get. I actually spoke at a leadership conference with a few years ago where the theme was failure. And we had to create failure resumes, give failure talks. We talked about worst mistakes you've ever made, jobs you didn't get, horrible bosses, like all that kind of stuff. You need to create an environment of psychological safety where people can be vulnerable and share. It was amazing as people opened up, and some were in tears about times that they tried things and failed and thought something would work out and it didn't. But that's still part of life, right? I always say, I mentioned this before, in the HR field, we talk about a career path as if it's this stroll in the park that's laid out for you. I say it's not a career path. It's a career roller coaster of ups and downs, twists and turns, exhilarating highs, terrifying plummets. And, that's what my career has been like. It really has been a roller coaster. And I just happen to be on a really big upswing right now. And I hate roller coasters, by the way, in real life. So I'm talking just metaphorically.
Oh, yeah. Well, so one of the stories that you shared a little bit of, and I'd love to, if you could share some more of this, is the speaking class, where again you had to confront that same thing about dragging your feet, hesitancy, self-doubt, and I just want to appreciate the fact that you call it self-doubt, because oftentimes today people use the words imposter syndrome to describe what really is self-doubt. Like everybody has self-doubt.
Yeah.
Some people do have imposter syndrome, but it's a whole different thing. Self-doubt is just, the natural hesitancy of, can I do this? What are people going to think? I've never done this before.
Yeah, if you've never done it before, how do you know you can do it now, right? It's a leap of faith in a lot of cases. Right?
Yeah. So I think you've had multiple of those, but there was another great story you had about the speaking course that you were in.
Yeah, I mean, everything, as I mentioned, everything I've always done was always back of the room, behind the scenes. Even as a project manager, I was never one to be out in front. I always like to be in the back. And even in classes, I would slump down back. I'm 6'4", so I always try to hide and slump down in the back row and try not to be noticed. In all my years of school, I never once spoke in front of a room or raised my hand. And my students always think, oh, you must have been like the school, class president and captain of the basketball team, whatever. It's like I was the farthest thing from the truth. But anyway, I always was terrible at public speaking and terrified of public speaking. And I try to avoid it at every opportunity. And then after 9/11, New York was kind of in a depression and work was slow and just there was a down mood and I wasn't working at the time. And I got a mailer to attend a free sampler 2-hour of Dale Carnegie's public speaking course, a human relations principle. So I forced myself to go. Again, even just going for a free 2-hour thing was like forcing myself. And I went and I met the people there, including Joe Armentano, who became a mentor who changed my life. And I decided to sign up for the Dale Carnegie public speaking course. And after the first session, at the break, I almost left. I literally didn't almost leave. I left. I packed my bags, took my coat, took the elevator down to the lobby and said, this is not for me. Because after the break, we were going to have to actually speak in front of everyone. And it was one of those crucible moments. And I said, if I go home, I'm just going back to the way I was and the way everything is. Nothing's going to change. If I force myself to go back up, and I actually went up to use the restroom. And then when I was there and everyone was back in the room, I peered through that little porthole window and they were just about to get started. And that was one of those defining moments. And they said, are you in or out? They literally said that, are you in or out? Coming in or out? We have to close the door. And I said, all right, I'm coming back in. And then, that changed. Like if I had not gone back in, I don't know what I'd be doing today. Because going back in, Dale Carnegie led to my confidence. And then they hired me as a trainer because I was so much better than I thought I was. Then I became a leadership trainer for them. That led to my job being hired by my colleague, Jeff Schwartzman, who was the head of learning and development for a company, a Wall Street company. He hired me to run their leadership institute, which I did for 3 years. Then I got laid off because of the financial crisis, started Big Blue Gumball, my own company. And that led to my teaching at NYU. And then that led to my teaching at Columbia. Both of those led to my TED Talk. All of that led to my book publication. All of that led to my joining the Marshall Goldsmith's MG 100. I was invited to join. And that led to my Thinkers 50 nomination. So it's like I could trace all of that back to that day that I looked through that porthole at Dale Carnegie and decided to go back in instead of going back home. So I call it like go in or go home. And I made the right decision because, who knows? It's like It's a Wonderful Life. You don't know if I had made a different choice, what I'd be doing today.
Well, it reminds me of the Steve Jobs quote that you cannot connect the dots looking forward. You can only connect them looking back. And you just did an awesome job of that. But the other piece of that is this, go in or go home. Yeah. It's such a powerful quote because when you put it that way, most people don't want to go home, meaning go back to the status quo, keep doing what you've been doing, live in that place of dissatisfaction, right? Just that in that same energy that you were in when you moved to LA, there was something that was not satisfying for you about where you were. And if you went home, you're just going to continue that. Yeah. And most people forget to look at that discomfort. They just say, I'm not going to go do this new thing because it's uncomfortable. And they're not paying attention to the discomfort of where they are. Yeah. So I think that idea of go in or go home is really powerful, just in its simplicity.
Yeah. As you were talking, I was thinking of the Bob Dylan lyric, when you've got nothing to lose. Right. Yeah. So the few times in my career where I hit rock bottom, it was like, you can't go below rock bottom if you're right. So it's kind of like, so even if, and I always had, again, channeling my mother, she would say with trying a new food, taste it. If you don't like it, you can spit it out. Right. But if you never taste it, same thing with moving out to LA. If you hate it, move back next week. Right. So if you always think there's an out and you're not trapped or stuck. So any of the decisions, if I walked in, going back into that Dale Carnegie room, I could have walked out 10 minutes later, even if I did go back in. So I always feel like as long as I have an out, then I don't feel like I'm locked in. And then it gives me a little more incentive or comfort in taking a risk or trying something. I think that's the thing. A lot of times we feel like college students, you don't take every job you can, go on every interview, even for jobs. I used to go on interviews for jobs I didn't want because I practiced my interviewing skills and there was no risk. And a few times I've gotten offered jobs that I didn't even want. I was just interviewing just to practice my interviewing skills, Yeah. So again, you never know. But if you don't put yourself out there, then you really don't know, right? And you don't grow. You grow through every, the Nelson Mandela quote, I never lose, I either win or I learn, right? Yeah. So if you look at everything as a learning opportunity, that's how we learn and that's how we grow. And we learn through failure as well. We just have to accept that failure is part of the learning process.
It's part of the process. Absolutely. Well, Todd, this is so great. Man, and this is, if you like these stories that you're hearing from Todd, you've got to buy his book, because this is like the tip of the iceberg. His book is full of stories of his life, and you have led a fascinating life and is full of tons of leadership lessons.
Speaking of tip of the iceberg, this is one of the pictures I keep on my desk to always remind me that everything is just the tip of the iceberg.
Yes, so true. So Todd, how can people get in touch with you, get in deeper with you, get below the surface if they want to connect with you and learn more?
Sure. The two best ways are just go to toddcherches.com, check out my website. You can find information about my book there and my TED Talk, or link in with me. Just say, I saw you on Rusty's show and you want to connect, and I'm happy to continue the conversation with anyone who'd like to reach out.
Awesome. Well, Todd, thank you so much for taking this time and sharing the story, but more importantly, the lessons from the story.
My pleasure, Rusty. Thanks for having me.